Hey everyone, I think the biggest sticking point for people when building a liquid-cooled system is fittings. It's just the one part that is going to be completely different every time. Unless you exactly copy somebody else's build, it's completely individual per build. And it's very hard to get to know all of the fittings that are out there because there's a lot of brands, and per brand I think BitsPower has 700 or 800 fittings in their range. There's no good guides out there as far as I know, because it's just almost impossible to do a good guide on fittings because it's completely different per build. I mean, I've tried to do a few guides on fittings over the years a long time ago, and I've covered fittings quite a few times in my build logs, but I've never really dug into the details properly. Well, that's kind of the way I feel. I have so many people coming to me and asking me, they say I'm building a liquid-cooled system and I want you to help me with the components. What components do I need? And they give me a list and everything's basically there except for the fittings. It's always the most difficult part. Now, for many years I've used BitsPower fittings. I mean, anyone who knows my builds knows that. So why haven't I really tried any other brands? Well, not for quite a long time now. That is because BitsPower just has the biggest range, and I do a lot of really kind of unusual configurations, very tight builds like this one, where if I don't have the necessary range of fittings, I mean, if all I have is 90 degree and hardline compression, I'm just never going to be able to pull it off. It's never going to happen. A lot of people, comment sometimes and say that I use too many fittings, but I don't think people get how tight the configurations are that I'm building. And if you intend on doing configurations like this, well then the only way that it's going to be possible is with a huge range of different fittings with exactly the right fittings. And so far for me that has only been possible with BitsPower. So for example, there are a lot of fittings up here. Now let's take a look at why. For this build, the customer really wanted fill ports. It was just a must. So why have I put them over there in the corner? Well, because there's going to be a radiator up here, a 360mm radiator and fans on the inside of the top panel. And you can see one of the mounting holes here for the radiator. So it comes right up to the edge there. It drops down 55mm inside. I did have the quad port caps on these Singularity Computers Protium reservoirs, but I had to remove them and use the triple port caps, which also come with the reservoirs, so that I could fit that radiator up there. And I still don't know if it's going to fit above these. I haven't even measured that yet. Let's take a look. So 55mm is what we need from the inside of the top panel. Okay, so yeah, you can see that it's just going to fit above that, which is absolutely perfect. That's what I was intending. Now, why are there so many fittings here? Well, because when there are a lot of components in extremely close vicinity, you obviously can't use tube. I mean, take a look at what I've had to do here. I have a 90-degree fitting coming up out of the top of the back reservoir, and then I've offset it with a 90-degree dual rotary. That's so that I can get around the edge of this panel just here, the shroud for the cables. And then I have a 90-degree single rotary and a 90-degree dual rotary to get around that. Then a telescopic fitting and a 90-degree single. And then over here I have a 45-degree fitting, 10mm extension, 90-degree dual rotary. So yeah, when there's a lot of components in extremely close vicinity and none of it lines up properly, you can see that none of this lines up at all. Well, the only way to do it is with a whole lot of fittings. Now, the alternative to this is if you can actually line up the fill ports exactly with the holes, then you're going to hardly use any fittings at all. But obviously we couldn't do that because we have a radiator up here. So, there's many situations like this where you just have no choice but to use a whole lot of fittings. And they're all going to be hidden back there behind the radiator, so it's going to look really, really clean later. I mean, all you're going to see from here is this 90-degree fitting and just kind of the bottom of this one here. Down the bottom here, it's a similar situation. I mean, we have to have a drainage system So we have a T fitting, we have a mini D plug, the drainage system, a 90-degree fitting so that I can get up to the side of the pump here. Now, because of Singularity Computers Protium components in this build, the reservoirs and the pump tops, we have a lot of extra inlets and outlets, which really helps with the reduction of fittings. I mean, this build just would not have been possible with any other pump and reservoir configuration. And you may not believe that, but without this amount of inlets and outlets, I never would have managed this very tight configuration. It just wasn't going to happen. Also, how compact these components are. I mean, I had to have this side inlet here, you know, to get up from here. I had to have the outlet here to get around to the bottom of the graphics cards. And yeah, it's a similar situation on the back one, just as complex. So you can see back there I've used extension fittings, and there's just no way you would get tube under there. It's just never going to happen. Fittings are the only way. I mean, you can see how tight this is. If you look down from above, you can just see that hardline compression fitting there. That's where the tube has to connect to. So you are looking at a collection of the only fittings that I use. Out of a huge range of bits power fittings, 700 or 800, whatever it's at now, this is all that I use. So let's start with the most commonly used fitting, the hardline compression fitting. Now, whether you want to use 12, 14 or 16 millimeter tube, it doesn't really matter. It's up to you. For me, the biggest difference between the sizes is really aesthetics, but there is also obviously flow to consider. That doesn't make a huge difference, but I mean, if you're going for performance, then a large tube size is the way to go. You do need to consider that 12 millimeter tube is the easiest to bend. The smaller the tube, the easier it is to bend. The larger the tube, the harder it is. 16 millimeter tube is kind of going to be a lot more difficult for beginners, and if you're trying offsets and kind of unusual tight bends. You know, if you're building an ITX system where it's an extremely compact situation, then you obviously want to go for 12 or 14 millimeter. And then 16 millimeter only in builds that are larger, where you're going for the extra performance. But yeah, I guess for me the main thing is aesthetics. I just always stick with 16 millimeter tube now because I prefer the way it looks. Now, how many of these fittings do you need? Well, this is actually the easiest one to count because you just need 2 per component. So count how many liquid cooling components you have in your build. You know, pump and res config, radiators, water blocks, the whole lot. 2 per component. Sometimes you don't need 2 per component. For example, if 2 components are extremely close together and you're going to use fittings between them, like up here with these fill ports, for example. But despite that, you know, you don't really know that because you're not going to... I really don't recommend planning out your entire loop so that you can figure out what fittings you need. That never works. Unless you have CAD and you can account for every single variable, it's never going to work. So I definitely don't recommend that at all. And so there are some things that you're just going to have to get a little bit extra of. Like maybe you can eliminate 2 of these hardline compression fittings, but, well, I guess if you really want to cut it fine, then consider that you don't need 2 of them. But I would just go for all of them. Now, the next most commonly used fitting is definitely the 90-degree single rotary. You're not going to be able to bend your tube in every situation. For example, this 90-degree single rotary just here, there is no way that I could do a tube bend that tight. The closest you can do a bend to the end of the tube without distorting the end of the tube is about 30 millimeters, and even that is cutting it fine. Now, if you do bend too close to the end and it does distort the tube, it won't fit into the fitting, and if you do manage to jam it into the fitting, you are going to get leaks. And there are many other tight situations which, you know, this build is an excellent example of, where you're just not going to be able to bend tube, and that is where these come in. Now, to explain the whole rotary thing, basically, rotary means a rotating section, a join. So on this fitting, just above the knurling here where my fingernail is, there is a join and it rotates. So that knurling rotates. And So that's a single rotary. This is a dual rotary. It has the same rotating section as this one, and then you can see it has another join that rotates just there. So when you're counting out the 90-degree single rotary, I would consider that you are going to need a 90-degree single rotary for at least half of your connections. So you need to get the same amount of 90-degree single rotaries that you have liquid cooling components in your build, and maybe even a couple of extra on top of that. The next most commonly used fitting is the 90-degree dual rotary. Now, this is an extremely versatile and useful fitting. So first of all, it is 10 millimeters higher and 10 millimeters longer that way than the 90-degree single rotary. So that can be used in certain situations where you need that extra length to eliminate the need for extra extension fittings. So let me see if I can find an example of that around here. Well, you know, where you have water blocks in the motherboard area, you might have a CPU water block, 2 motherboard water blocks, 2 memory water blocks, you know, MOSFET, IMC. And you have all of these different heights between the water blocks, and you want to make up those heights without a whole bunch of extension fittings. And yeah, that's where it can be great. But for me, this is just awesome for offsets, like down here, where I need to get around the bottom of the D5 pump covers, and then up that tiny little gap there, which you can see is almost not even enough for the tube. So yeah, it's great for offsets. It's also great where you need basically any angle from 0 to 90 degrees, because you can see up here I've kind of used it for an offset, but also a 45-degree angle, because just there I have a 90-degree dual rotary and then a 45-degree fitting. So yeah, I've got the offset across to the left and I've got a 45. So just an awesome versatile fitting. I would get at least 4 of those, preferably 6 per build. Now this is not the next most used fitting. I would just get 2 of these. This is a 45-degree single rotary. It is only sometimes useful. Like I use this in kind of 1 in 3 builds for very tight, difficult situations, kind of to get me out of trouble. So next is definitely extension fittings. And you just need to get all of the different lengths of extension fittings. I would get, actually, first of all, this is not classified as an extension fitting. It's like a coupler or something. I've forgotten the name of this. But basically, it's just a 1/4-inch thread male to a 1/4-inch thread female. This gives you exactly 10 millimeters of extension. So actually, if you put that onto that 90-degree single, it makes it the exact same height as this 90-degree dual. So it's not classified as an extension. It's not in the extension section. It's in the it's usually in the adapter section or something like that. But I consider it to be an extension, and this is a fitting that I use a lot to gain me, you know, a little bit of extra length here and there. I'm just trying to look if I've used it in this, but it doesn't look like I've used it in this build yet. Oh yeah, you can see that I think I've used one just in there. But anyway, the next one is 15 millimeters. So I would get 4 of the 10, 4 of the 15, 4 of the 20, 2 of the 25, 2 of the 30, 2 of the 40, and 2 of the 50. And that'll basically cover you in almost any situation. Okay, after that, what I use most completely depends on the build. And now we're starting to get into quite kind of uncommon territory, fittings that I might use in some builds but not in others, but I would still grab them anyway. So D-plugs. I love to use D-plugs. Actually, the 1-inch D-plug can be used between graphics cards, which are, I think, 2 slots apart, you know, as the connection between the graphics cards instead of tube or these telescopic fittings. I mean, they can also be used in that situation, but I use these in situations where you need rotation and a quick disconnect, because that's what they're for. They're actually, they pop in and out. You know, they're a pull fitting. They're not no spill, that's for sure. So, you know, they're not really useful for quick disconnects at all. because of that. They're more useful for rotation, and I usually use them on bits power mini valves for the drainage system. So you can see I have one just there connecting the drainage system, so I need the rotation here. And yeah, I just find it's the best fitting to use in this situation, because you can use something in that situation with a male-to-male thread like this, but it's going to rotate until it tightens, and it may tighten, you know, over here on an angle or something. But yeah, you don't want that. I've also used one up here. So there are certain assemblies like this one where you can't even assemble it unless you have a D-plug, because the reservoir and the pump and reservoir configuration is fixed, the top panel is fixed, and you have to get those fittings in between somehow. So that's where they're really useful, to help you to connect up a configuration like that. You know, otherwise it would just be almost impossible without like removing the pump and res combo or removing the top panel of the case or something like that. So I would just get 2 mini D-plugs, and that's probably enough, unless you want to use D-plugs between the graphics cards. In that case, you get a couple of 1-inch D-plugs. Telescopic fittings are useful in a very similar situation to these, but they give you some more options, because you can see that the longest type, that extends a really long way. There's actually a line on these fittings. That line just there tells you when to stop. Do not go past that line. These are also compression fitting. This here tightens up to compress onto it and to stop it from, well, it doesn't completely stop it, but it, you know, it seals it up. So this gives you rotation, it gives you telescopic length, extremely handy in difficult tight builds. Can also be used between graphics cards. When you can't make up a length with extension fittings, you can always make up a length with these. So always grab at least a couple of these. I would say 2 of the small, 1 of the large, you know, something like that. Maybe 1 of the medium as well. So, for example, in this build, I've used the large across there. And yes, I could have used extension fittings there, but extension fittings will not give you male to male either. They'll give you male to female, and then you need to find a way of dealing with that. And also, if you try to use extension fittings, you have a fixed length, and how are you going to tighten them up? Well, you've got to flex the reservoirs apart and then kind of tighten them together. So with this, you don't have to get, you know, manhandle it and damage the components to get them into position. So they're absolutely great for many different situations. Now, these two are one of my little secrets. I've been using this for a very, very long time. And a lot of people wonder, I don't think they wonder anymore, I think people have figured it out by now, but again, when you have a lot of water blocks on the motherboard area, so CPU, 2 motherboard water blocks, 2 memory water blocks, well, I've mentioned that the difference between these two is 10 millimeters. The gap between this fitting and this fitting is 5 and 5 and 5. So the smallest gap between extension fittings is 5 millimeters. What if you have a difference in height of 2.5 millimeters instead? And that happens a lot. Like often between the CPU water block and the MOSFET water block, you'll have a difference of 2.5 mil. And if you try to use a difference of 5 mil, well, then the fittings are going to be on an angle like this. So that is where these come in. This will give you a difference of 2.5 millimeters if you combine these two, and then, you know, you use your 90-degree fitting or whatever you want. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if that doesn't give you the height that you want? Like, what I mean is, if this is too long, longer than it needs to be, what if you only need, you know, this kind of length at 2.5 millimeters? Well, that's the beauty of this area of the build. It really doesn't matter what height you're at. So, you know, if it ends up too high, you can just put another extension in here and just lift the whole config up as far as you want. As long as you get that 2.5 millimeter difference, it doesn't matter what height it's at, it will all still look really streamlined anyway. So yeah, that's a great little secret that I use really often. This is a through panel fitting, so this is used for fill ports like this, and also in situations where, like over here, you go through a panel and out the other side. And it's just a 1/4 inch thread that runs all the way through so that you can connect the fitting to both sides. So 1/4 inch all the way through, and then a compression in the middle to tighten onto the panel. A little O-ring there to make it tight to stop it from rotating. An excellent fitting to have if you're going to be doing any mods. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Stop fittings are fairly obvious. There's a few different types. I like to use these in permanent locations that you're not meant to undo. So, for example, this extra port here that we're not going to use, well, that's something you're never going to remove, not to drain the system, not to fill the system, not for any reason at all. So that's where I like to use these low profile ones, and that's because they're kind of difficult to grab onto, so it kind of discourages people from undoing them. This one I like to use for situations like this where it's a fitting where you do need to undo it, or like a fill port, on the top here. And this one the same, but this one is, better aesthetics, kind of a theme thing. So for this build, I thought because we have 2 fill ports up the top here and it's a bit of a feature, I'd use the nice looking stop fittings up there. Okay, bits power mini valve is very obvious. This is for the drain port. I use this every time. Quite costly, but just beautiful. I mean, everything about these fittings, they last for many, many years. I have bits power fittings that are, nearly 10 years old, and they still look brand new. They still look exactly the same, like they've never been used before. Now, these two are used in similar situations. This is always where you're in a situation where you need an extra port. Now, why would you need an extra port? Well, a drainage system, a fill system, a temp sensor. So they're the sorts of things that I use these for. I prefer this one because it's really clean, it's hardly noticeable, it's just really low profile, and yeah, you can see that I've used one of those just in there for the drain port, and it's just positioned the drain port perfectly. It's allowed me to run out to where I need to go to connect the tube to. It's a beautiful fitting. No rotary though, so you need to combine this with something like this. Now again, that's going to run you into the problem of wherever it tightens up is where it ends up. But sometimes you can manipulate that to get it where you want it, but I don't usually do that. I normally use, in that situation, a D-plug. Now, this one does have the rotary, so that's why it can be more useful. It also has more ports. There's a few different types of these. There's a T, there's a Q, which I think is this one, which has, the T, but then the extra one on the top. And now I think there's also one with ports on every single side. So, you could use this in a situation where you need both a drain port and a temp sensor. Or sometimes, like, the height difference between these two is different. So sometimes you might need to make up a different height or something. So the amounts of these fittings, I forgot to mention the stop fittings, how many you need, but that's pretty obvious. You just count them out based on your components. These, I would just decide which way you want to go, but that is still going to be difficult, so I would just get 2 of each, or even 1 of each is going to be enough. But the tighter you build, the more fittings you're going to need pretty much. If you are planning on using fittings for the bends, then this fitting is ideal. It's a 90-degree fitting with a female 1/4 inch thread on each side. And all you do is you use your hardline compression fittings, screw them straight in, and then you have fittings for the bends. So for example, in this build here, so really you're going to end up with a pile of fittings that looks similar to this, except you're going to just have a couple more of each. So overall, it's not a lot of fittings. The one you're going to have the most of is obviously this one. But yeah, I really hope that that's cleared things up a little bit for you. At some point when I have more time, I'll do a proper, concise video on fittings where I cover all of the builds that I've done and well, not all of them maybe, but a lot of them. And, I think I could really put together something that will help people if I had the time. But thank you for watching. and I hope you're enjoying all the videos.